Listen-only mode.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar, Securing Your Bank Connectivity. Before we get started, let's review a few of the webinar logistics. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We are in listen-only mode, and we are recording today's webinar. If at any time you have a question that you would like to see answered, please type it in your GoToWebinar box, and we'll have an opportunity to answer questions at the end of the webinar. And if you have any technical issues, please dial 1-888-259-8414 to connect with a GoToWebinar support member, and they'll help you join the webinar. And just a reminder, we'll also be offering CTP and SPNA credits for today's webinar for everyone who's attended. And you'll see those approval letters in your email within the next several days. And again, just a reminder, we're recording today's webinar and we'll make it available to all attendants via email. Or you can also find it on our website within the next few days. And with that, I'll pass the presentation off to Bob here.
Great, thank you very much. And Tom, welcome today. I appreciate you being a co-presenter with me on this.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's always fun to present with you, and especially on a topic like this, which ties in very nicely to the Treasury in Practice Guide that was just released by AFP. I think this is going to be a great topic for today. Before we kind of go into the agenda and stuff, Tom, did you want to briefly just talk about what that guide is, just for those folks that may not have seen it since it literally just came out the other day?
Yeah, it just came out yesterday. It's part of our Treasury in Practice series, and the guide is titled Putting Your Connectivity on Lockdown, and highlights a lot of the different things you should consider and some of the different methodologies and way to connecting and getting access to bank information, but it does it nicely in 5 or 6 pages, so it's a short but deeply impactful read. So we try to make our Treasury in Practice series geared to people that just want to pick up something and have a quick read and then have a few good takeaways back and things to think about. So it's available on our website on afponline.org, and then just go to our guides and then go to our Treasury in Practice series guides.
Sounds perfect, Tom. Thank you for that. So without further ado, let's get into the agenda and today's discussion points. There's really 5 things, including Q&A at the end, that we want to go through in the next sort of 45, 50 minutes. The ideal is to finish at the top of the hour, and we'll do everything we can to finish there, as well as leave some time for questions at the very end of that time. In terms of the agenda, impact of fraud on bank connectivity is probably a good place to start, Tom, I think, given what's going on in the world today. We'll then go into a bit more on payment connectivity than bank statement reporting, but we'll talk briefly to both those areas. I think, in fairness, payment connectivity is the one that is where we're in corporate treasury a bit more concerned about the security. It's not to say that bank statement reporting isn't something that we want in other people's hands. We certainly don't want it in other people's hands. But definitely the urgency, if you will, is more on payments, and that's where we're going to spend most of the discussion today. We'll spend a little bit of time at the end around future of connectivity, just because there are some things that are changing in the payment and connectivity space. Everything from more instant payments to SWIFT's global payment innovation initiative for cross-border payments, as well as things like distributed ledger technology and blockchain. We certainly want to address those as well in the context of just making sure that security of your bank connectivity is first and paramount for every organization. So with that, I put up a slide like this. I think most of us are familiar with some of the incidents that happened in 2016. And before that, maybe from fraud and cybercrime standpoint, we kind of looked at a diagram like this. We were concerned about payments, obviously, and fraud detection, and investments in trading, and bank account management. Like all these sort of things framed our view of what was important from a fraud and cybercrime prevention standpoint. After some of the incidents that we saw earlier in the year, suddenly connectivity became part of that discussion. The question, can our connectivity in corporate be compromised? And it's definitely a worthy question. In fairness, if you don't do things right, then yes, your connectivity workflows can be at risk. And Tom, we've talked a lot about this. There's certainly some learning, and that was well documented in your Treasury and Practice guide that you just referenced a few moments ago. But we learned some things from those scenarios, and kind of put it in 3 buckets, which help frame some of the ways that we can protect our connectivity. So number 1, we found that separation of duties was critical. Some of the evidence and information that was written about in media suggested that was one of the areas that was problematic, is not having appropriate separation of duties between the different roles and users in terms of initiating payments. User ID and password, I think we all know this anyways, but that's just not enough security to protect your systems, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. We certainly want to have more pieces of information required than just user ID and password. And the last one is, and this is a very key point, is that preventing payments fraud is more than just protecting that point of initiation. There's more to that workflow, and so we have to think of not just who can access my way that I initiate payments or that I receive bank statements, but what about the rest of the workflow? What is the entire workflow, and are there different opportunities that we can protect each stage of that workflow? And that's the genesis of what Tom and I are going to go through today, is making sure that all the different checkpoints throughout your workflow are areas that you're thinking about, and obviously be able to understand some best practices around. So in terms of putting it into a diagram, if we look at just typical bank reporting connectivity, and this is obviously on the statement reporting side, it looks, give or take, something like this. Most people have a TMS or an ERP that is receiving all this information, such as prior day and current day reporting. So in the US, BAI2, we have MT940 for more international banks. We have a prevalence of XML, CMT formats, which are starting to, in some cases, even replace BAI. And then depending on the country and region we're talking about, there's some regional formats as well, which could be a long conversation, could almost take up the whole webinar just talking about those. But the idea is that you're generally getting those from some sort of connectivity hub. So I'm loosely calling it a connectivity hub. That connectivity hub effectively means that there's different ways to connect to the bank. And you may choose, like Swift is obviously a great way to connect. I think we all know the advantages of Swift and what they bring to the table. So in many cases, organizations will use Swift for some or all of their connectivity, which is a great idea. There's also host-to-host connections. Not every bank supports those, but when they do, then that can be an alternative, depending on, of course, the volume of activity the banks are talking about, whether they support it. And then we also, depending on the regions, whether we're in France or Germany or Switzerland or Japan or Brazil, we might have these regional networks that are more in-country specific to the banks in that particular region. So when we say bank reporting connectivity, it's effectively a one-way traffic. It's taking information from the banks via whatever means, making sure obviously they're secure and encrypted and all those sorts of things, and then providing those to whatever you're using as a treasury tool, be it TMS, be it ERP, be it spreadsheets, hopefully not, but whatever it is that you're using, that's basically a one-way traffic. Now, when we talk about payments, a little bit different. There's a few more arrows. It complicates the diagram a little bit for the simple reason that we are sending information from our, whatever our treasury system might be, and we're sending those to the bank via those same types of communication protocols. So Swift, again, great way to send payments to the bank. Might find that there's scenarios that deserve host-to-host or utilizing regional networks, depending on your profile of banks and payments and accounts and all those sorts of variables that we've talked about in prior webinars. Then you're remitting those payments securely from whatever connectivity hub or solution you're using to, say, Swift as an example, but Swift is not the only way, and there may be other ways that you're doing it as well. However you're reaching the bank, the key thing is that you're also getting acknowledgments in return. We're going to talk about that aspect of the workflow. We can't forget about that piece of it. So those ACKs for short, or acknowledgments, basically the confirmations of the payments, are being sent via whatever protocol that you connected to the bank in the first place, so be it Swift, be it an FTP or host-to-host connection, be it the regional networks, and they're being sent back to your treasury system so that you know everything that you sent actually was received, actually was processed, etc. You'll notice, just in case you're nitpicking, that there's certain numbers, and those numbers represent basically different levels of acknowledgement. So with Swift, we actually have more protocols and more ways, or more protocols, more acknowledgements and levels of acknowledgement than we would otherwise have. Oops, sorry for the delay there. I think I had a bit of a technology bump there. Anyway, so back to this particular workflow, what we have is different ways to obviously protect the workflow, and that's what we're going to talk about in this session today. So let's kind of get into the details and understand these connectivity risks. These connectivity risks really come into 7 different pieces. So when I say 7 different pieces, you can see them on this slide, and we're going to go through, Tom and I, all these different sessions in terms of protecting the front part, access to the software, all the way through to workflow changes within the payment systems and everything in between. So Tom, I know there's definitely a lot of things to cover that we're going to touch on in the next 35, 40 minutes. Anything you want to touch on before we start with number 1?
Yeah, I think you touched on it, I think, earlier in the deck, but, you know, I think why all of a sudden is there this payment connectivity risk or your bank portal risk? And I think if I sit back and listen to what my banking partners say, you know, they're tasked with maintaining control of, you know, the payments ecosystem. So they have to make sure through KYC and AML and all of the different regulations, they know who's transacting, you know, who's making payments, who's conducting the business. And so if you come into it with kind of that mindset of, you know, the banks and the partners in the ecosystem have to maintain control of the safety of that payments ecosystem, whether it be the ACH network or the FedWire network. I think if you think about it with that kind of in the background, but then looking at it from your own perspective of, you know, from a corporate perspective, how are you protecting that? How are you protecting access to your connectivity? So it's just kind of a framework for these 7 different things as we go forward.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom, and I agree with you completely. Now, as you can see in this slide, before we start going into each of these different 1 through 7 steps, we're talking about payment connectivity primarily, but obviously what we're talking about can be applied to bank reporting as well. But as mentioned in the outset, generally out of the 2, you're really more concerned about payments because that's money out the door that you don't want to have happen in an unauthorized way. But we are still interested in protecting bank statement reporting, so don't think we're ignoring that. We're just kind of taking the grander approach and touching on all the different pieces that relate to payments. But where it relates to bank reporting, we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So as I go into the first point here, access to software used for payment initiation, approval, and transmission. Basically access to your payment system or treasury system, your ERP, whatever you're using to initiate, approve, and then obviously transmit payments, that part of the workflow. These are very basic ideas, and I think most people on the phone probably know it, so I don't think, Tom, we need to spend a lot of time on this. But any additional comments you want to add besides the obvious that your user ID and your password really shouldn't be all that it takes to get into your system?
Yeah, I think you know, I've heard more members of AFP talking about having their Treasury workstation or their bank portal PC or however they're accessing it to putting it onto one machine and not having that machine on their network as a way to kind of ring fence their, you know, if something comes through on a file or something, you know, through all the different email scams and the wire scams and things like that, they just want to have the ability to quarantine some of that to a certain extent. So I don't know if you're hearing more about that. I've heard a few members talking about it, but you know, back when I was practicing Treasury, you know, we had a system for dialing up the bank reports and things separate because it, you know, it was through the old dial-up modem back in those days. But I'm not sure if you're hearing clients talking about separating their LAN, you know, their corporate-wide LANs from their Treasury technology at all.
Well, I think it definitely was much more applicable when we had on-premise systems, for that simple reason that Treasury wanted to be secure and be separate from some of the risks that might occur on-premise, like within an installed environment. Obviously with the cloud, it's a very different set of combinations, but in fairness, not everyone on the phone is going to have their treasury system in the cloud. So that is a reasonable practice to consider if that IT can't guarantee the security of your network and your machine against some of these sophisticated scams that are coming out. Obviously in the cloud, then there's a whole different set of solutions there. And generally speaking, most systems, both ERP and Treasury, as well as bank portals, are all in the cloud and protected in that way. But it's a good point, Tom. The one thing that I'll mention, maybe not necessarily all these different bullet points, but multi-factor authentication, I think most of us in Treasury are pretty familiar with that. Generally more the hard tokens, like the ones, the key fobs that sometimes if we have lots of banks, we have a drawer full of these things lying around. Those are the ones that sometimes drive us a little crazy in Treasury. In many cases, that hard token, one per bank or one per system, has been replaced by more soft token, like utilizing your mobile phone as that recipient of those very sophisticated codes. The last 30 seconds, you get them sent to your smartphone as opposed to having to have a specific device for each different system you need to log into. So that's one point that's a little bit newer. The other one is there's a lot of IT groups, especially as they get more involved in Treasury, which is, I always applaud that and think it's a great thing to ensure that Treasury is aligned with information security policies of the organization, which are represented by IT, is we do see a lot of demand for single sign-on with internal IT environments for the simple reason that it allows IT to ensure that what Treasury is using to access the system in terms of these different controls can be aligned exactly with what IT is set up for, say, your laptop or desktop or whatever you're using to get into the systems in the first place. So basically your Windows password and all the controls that go along with that, getting into Windows allows you to access your browser and have that straight through login, integrated login into the Treasury system. So that's something that we're seeing quite a bit when IT is a bit more involved. But not always, and in many cases there's a combination of these controls that go into play rather than just picking one or another because there's different situations. Sometimes you're on network, but sometimes you're logging in remotely from home because it's the day after Thanksgiving and you just didn't want to come in that day, but you still had to do a little bit of Treasury work. So making sure that all those different scenarios are covered is extremely important. Going on to the second point, and I know this the first one was relatively easy, Tom. This one gets into a little bit more detail, although generally speaking we get this idea of separation of duties. I don't think most people scratch their head and think, what is separation of duties? Why would I want to do that? I think we get why that's important. Where it tends to become a bit more problematic to actually implement is where we have a bit of desegregation and separation of people and in different offices that are contributing to Treasury. Now I say contributing to Treasury, Treasury may be domiciled in headquarters and the global Treasury is 2 or 3 people and they manage the entire world, but in many cases we're finding that there's people that are part of Treasury that are elsewhere, or there's folks that maybe are initiating payments, maybe even payment on behalf of or shared services that aren't technically part of Treasury but still are part of the family of Treasury in terms of initiating, approving, and transmitting payments. So the issue, as you can see what I put in the slides here, and Tom, I'll turn it over to you in a second, is that we want to ensure that there's consistency. Any inconsistency of payment types, geographies, the systems used, if we basically have differences based on different scenarios, because Treasury versus ERP, they're initiated differently because they're different separation of duties. Those are the sorts of inconsistencies that we want to stamp out because those create exposures for potential fraud or cybercrime. So Tom, I know this is one that we've talked about before, so I know you have a few things on this as well.
No, definitely. I think you want to have your policy for your payments processing be consistent across the organization. It's oftentimes, if it's decentralized, Treasury has a hard time implementing those policies without the help and support of, those, if they're working with shared service centers or we're working with regionalized Treasury group, having the centralized control of those policies is key, but also having it reviewed, having audit sign off on it, working in conjunction with Sarbanes-Oxley and some of the things that auditors are now asking about in terms of proof of controls and and that effort is stepping up more. But I think what you want to make sure is the process is scalable going forward, certainly transportable. So when you have new acquisitions, you want to make sure that you can take your process and quickly export it into a new organization, or if that means new bank accounts and whatnot, you just want to make sure that that process is followed, realizing, of course, if it's international, it's going to be a little more tricky depending on the legal entities and what's involved. But at a minimum, you want to make sure it's it's been reviewed. A lot of times organizations have certain sign-off levels for the organization for different management level can sign off on a certain thing, but you always want to know what you're signing off on and understanding. So definitely work with the auditors. In my days when I worked at 3M, I worked with the auditors on these types of policies because they're the ones that were out in the field and could be where I couldn't be and be an extension of the Treasury control in a way that they're making sure that our policies around payments were being followed.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, that it is a collaboration. I mean, if this was easy to do across all payments that are going out the door, then everyone would have done it already, and there would be no need to talk about such things in a webinar like this. But the fact is that sometimes it is complicated for those reasons, and sometimes the CFO they have everyone reporting to them, including IT sometimes, and that makes it a little bit easier to collaborate. But it is important to do this because any inconsistencies can be exploited, and when we have a possibility of that inconsistency, that exposure that can be exploited, then we have the potential for problems. So we want to make sure that that separation of duties is consistent globally across all different systems, across all different banks, across all different payment types, etc. So good points on that, Tom. Now, if we look at the next point, transmission to the bank connectivity channel. So we talked about accessing, say, your payment systems or your treasury systems already. We talked about the second point, which is really around separation of duties, making sure the right people can do the right things and the wrong people can't do the right things. Third part is transmission to the bank connectivity channel. And this is an interesting one. Sometimes it gets glossed over a little bit, but I wanted to define it in this way. Securing access to that channel really means a couple different things. One, if we have multiple systems used, so let's just say we're using ERP for accounts payable, we're using Treasury for Treasury payments, maybe we want to utilize Treasury with a payment factory capability so that we're actually taking files from ERP to Treasury and using Treasury as a connectivity hub, which a lot of people do. We want to make sure those files are secured when traveling in between systems. That's really, really important. If we're utilizing some sort of gateway to the different banks, such as Swift is a good example of that because they have a great, with Alliance Flight 2, a great gateway to the banks that is a lot of organizations, corporates use. You want to make sure that the files are secure when transmitting over there as well. So it doesn't matter what systems are involved. The systems are going to be secure, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But you also need to make sure, and this is generally where corporates sometimes, not say lose sight of it, but don't realize the importance of it as much and don't prioritize it as much in their security policy, is to ensure that in transit between systems is covered as well. If there is many systems, then obviously the good authentication protocols to ensure that each system has that consistent access. This kind of goes back to that point number one we talked about a few minutes ago, making sure that no matter what systems are used, you have the appropriate separation of duties and you have the appropriate user ID, password, other pieces of information that makes sure that only authorized people can get at those systems. One thing that I like to see, we see this more in Europe and not as much in the US, but it's starting to emerge a little bit, is digital signatures. I prefer Swift 3S key just because it's a global standard. There are other choices out there as well. But where it's possible to apply digital signatures to authenticate outgoing payments, then that's obviously a really good practice as well, because then the bank is expecting a digital signature, i.e. you, and if it's not coming from you, it's not stamped with that digital signature, so to speak, then they know that there's a problem and that needs to be looked at. So it's just yet another opportunity where exceptional payments that are coming in a little bit different than they're supposed to can be flagged and can be looked at to ensure that they were authorized in the first place. The last one, and Tom, I know we've talked about this before, is this idea of integrating sanction lists and making sure that sanction lists are part of the corporate treasury workflow and not just the responsibility of the bank. And the key thing here is if you're integrating that, and some people do, some people don't, depending on the amount of payments that are going into far-reaching places potentially, or what kind of concerns they have, is that if you are integrating sanctions lists, you really, really, really want to make sure that it's uneditable payments that are being against that. There's really no value whatsoever to screening them. Let's just say when the payment's first been initiated, but still could be approved a couple different times and still could be modified by a potential super user or approver. It doesn't make sense to do that, because then stuff can be changed afterwards, and then your sanction tracking, which you thought was reasonable and checking everything, it's not able to check the final product before it goes to the bank. So I stress that uneditable part, make sure it's in its final state where it can't be changed, and then review that against sanction lists, maybe something that you want to do before you send it over to the banks as well. Tom, I know this is one that you have a few points on, so I definitely want to
so definitely number one, you think about your payroll file. If you're sending an ACH file for direct deposit to your bank, you definitely want that to be encrypted throughout the process. You don't want certain individuals to be able to get into it and then alter it in some fashion or find out other information, because all that information is very sensitive. So having it encrypted from the point of origination all throughout the points that it might touch, with the endpoint arriving at the bank, is absolutely critical. That was something that we talked a lot about at our advisory group meeting. That was actually one of the strongest takeaways we had, was just making sure that all your banking files, whether it just be bank information or payment information, be definitely encrypted end to end. So making sure when you hit the submit button on a wire, whatever format it goes through from your bank, if you're inside the bank portal, that's a different, I think you're probably a little more protected, but if you're sending files through a workstation or host to host or some other method, and it goes up to so through a gateway or something, you want to make sure everything is definitely encrypted throughout that process. The other thing I'll mention on this is we have some members that are trending towards bank agnostic systems, so either through their Treasury workstation or a payment gateway or through a third-party solution. They're making sure that their connectivity is very transportable, so they send one file format, and then this payment aggregator or this information aggregator is sending this information out to their bank and acting as a conduit. There is more cost to it, but should they need to change banks, it's merely a flip of a switch, which a lot of Treasury people know that changing banks on the cash management side can be pretty painful. But I've seen companies doing that just in the trying to make sure that they're covered globally, and these tend to be companies more in the emerging markets where maybe a bank decides to get out of that marketplace and they need to find a solution very quickly. In the U.S., it's probably not as much the case, but that's something that we've definitely heard about.
Yeah, well, actually, I find it definitely happening in all regions for the simple reason that you don't want, think of the old school way of connecting to banks, and IT was managing things and working with firewalls and taking care of the formats and all that stuff. IT doesn't want to be in that business. They have no interest in, and nor are they resourced properly to deal with emerging bank changes. So having this, we'll call it on-premise connectivity, is just not feasible. And as a result, yeah, you look at, that's why solutions like Swift brought out Alliance Light 2 for the exact reason that they recognize there's an absolute necessity to put this kind of thing in the cloud and take it away from being a responsibility for IT to support Treasury. They wanted to put more power in the hands of Treasury. Treasury systems, same kind of thing. Like, they're in the cloud, they provide this ability to connect to the bank, sometimes using multiple means depending on the system involved, but the whole point, and going back to the point of this slide, and I think you're dead on this, Tom, is that you need to make sure that whatever systems are being used, whatever providers are being used, that end-to-end it's secure. And just don't assume just because each individual system is secure in itself that the whole workflow is secure. You just can't make that assumption. You need to be sure. And that's a key point that auditors, both internally and externally, are going to be very interested in, is to make sure that your whole connectivity workflow, everything we're talking about here, not just certain points or certain systems, are going to be encrypted and secure. So excellent point on that, Tom. I quite agree. Now, the fourth point is the actual, what I'm calling the bank connectivity channel. So when I say connectivity channel, I know there's lots of different vocabulary that goes out, but here's some examples of different ways that corporates connect to banks. Sometimes, especially in the U.S., we see host-to-host connections like FTP as an example. Those can be handled by TMS, they can be handled by the ERP, they can be handled by IT doing it themselves, which Tom and I just talked about is not necessarily the most efficient way to do things, but nonetheless, we see those scenarios. There's domestic and regional networks. Certain countries, the U.S. is not amongst them, but there are certain countries that have a network, like BACS in the UK, or we see EBIX in Germany or Switzerland or France, and we see Zengen and Answer in Japan as an example. So these domestic networks, which basically connect to multiple banks in that region, that's another channel to potentially connect to the bank. We see MT, the concentrator service, which is basically shared BIC. There's not very many providers that do that on the payment side. For bank reporting, you see it a little bit more, but for payments, especially for KYC purposes, you don't typically see this utilized very often, and many banks will just not want a payment coming from some other organization's BIC. They kind of want it coming from the corporate itself for obvious KYC reasons, but it is an option that is used by some, I guess. There's Swift Alliance Flight 2, great solution. That one's hosted by Swift. Most cases you'll see it integrated into TMS, but obviously making sure it's integrated behind the scenes into TMS as opposed to a surface level integration is important. There's service bureaus that offer SwiftNet, and then there's obviously just installing Alliance Access yourself as a corporate, which isn't quite as prevalent for some of the reasons we talked about before, just because Swift has realized that there's a better option with the cloud and Alliance Flight 2, and I'm not going to make it a Swift sales pitch. They can do excellent things with that themselves, but certainly identify that you're seeing a lot of movement, not so much with installed Swift software by corporates, but definitely a movement towards Service Bureau and hosting via Swift via Alliance Flight 2. But all of these different options are utilized for payments, and so we can't ignore any of them just because some may be more popular than others. So when we say these multiple channels to connect, what we're really curious about and want to make sure we emphasize is that we want to make sure the safeguards of the hosted connectivity or the service bureaus or whoever is providing the connectivity, and that may be your own IT group. Generally, it's probably your TMS or your ERP. In some cases, it's going to be a third party altogether. You want to make sure that they are providing the same level of security that aligns with your organization's information security. So I want to make sure what they're doing is acceptable with what your IT group says is the minimum standard you should be following. So some of those points, Tom, and there's a lot of the different points, but we tried to keep it within a relatively small slide so we didn't have too much information on here. But some of those things are reviewing the SOC 1 or SOC 2 audits. Generally, SOC 2 is much more preferable because it's a bit more objective. Trusted service principles, there's penetration testing, there's the data security, like the actual system itself, what are they doing? There's business continuity. And I say there is business continuity, obviously there is, but making sure that connectivity is just as secure in a disaster recovery or business continuity situation as it is in production. We don't want a fall off just because you're in disaster recovery and we need to connect via the backup systems that the vendor provides. That doesn't absolve the responsibility to provide security throughout, because if that was the case, then you would find that maybe cyber criminals would find ways to trigger a disaster recovery situation just so that the security was lessened. We definitely don't want that as a situation. And I know you've seen lots of different things, Tom, and the members certainly have different thoughts on this, but it's certainly one of those areas that needs to be better evaluated so that you feel confident that whatever providers you're using for connectivity to actually connect to the banks are following all the same rules that has been identified in your organization as the minimum acceptable standard.
Yeah, and that I think a couple takeaways from this is the SOC 1, SOC 2, the old SAS 70 audits. Yeah, I think a lot of times Treasury is on an island, and getting the needs of the IT group is a challenge, and so a lot of Treasury professionals are sitting and trying to decipher some of those SOC 1, SOC 2 results or reports, and for them it's challenging because they want to bring on this vendor, but they don't necessarily have the resources to help them validate some of those things. And so if maybe I'll throw it back to you, Bob, just, if you're looking quickly at a SOC 1 or SOC 2, what are some of the highlights that Treasury person should be looking at maybe for some of those audits?
Well, for starters, if Treasury wants to read that, it's probably something they need to. They'll be overwhelmed really quickly, because these audit reports, and I mean the whole report, not just like some letter saying that a SOC 1 exists or SOC 2 exists, because in fairness, that's not really enough to evaluate. It does need to be read, especially SOC 1, where the organization is generally creating their own control objectives. You want to make sure that their control objectives are the things that you care about. SOC 2, there's these trust service principles, 5 different principles with a bit more objectivity, but still it needs to be read. The existence of that audit report is not enough. It's not a pass-fail thing. Like, oh, they have it, great, good enough, check mark, let's go on in our evaluation. That's not the case. It needs to be evolved, or it needs to be reviewed to very much ensure that it is, well, providing the level of security that you expect from your provider. And for Treasury, Tom, it's, as you know, it's not exactly the easiest reading. We're Treasury professionals, we're not necessarily IT professionals. And as a result, in many cases, it's very important to have the relevant folks within the organization be able to review this, those that can understand the details and what's a positive thing and what's maybe a potential weakness, and they can provide that analysis to Treasury. Which basically is another way of saying, yes, it's important to have information security professionals in your organization part of your evaluation process to ensure that Treasury is making the right decision when it comes to the level of controls, the different security that's being put in place. So it's kind of a long answer to your short question, but I think it is very relevant.
Sure. And just one last point on the SOC reports. I've heard members asking, it seems the auditors are clamping down more on the SOC 1 and SOC 2 calendar year versus a fiscal year for a corporation. And if there's a difference, a lot of companies are going back and asking those providers for like a bridge letter. So if the letter is dated March 30th and their year end is not to the following December, they're asking those vendors for a bridge letter, which often is enough for the auditor to sign off on it. But I'm hearing more and more of that, as opposed to taking it verbatim, even if it was 3 to 5 months old.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because this is serious stuff. You need to ensure that the control objectives are as recently evaluated as possible to satisfy both regulatory requirements that you have on your side, but also just peace of mind, so that you know that this is something that wasn't a year old and stale information, that it's relatively recent. So, yes, very good point on that, Tom. Now, I know we could talk about SOC reports all day, but we'll move on to other parts of the workflow and talk not just about the actual connectivity channel. We'll make the assumption in our workflow that we've already evaluated all the different points up to sending information to the bank. Step 5 is actually receiving information back from the bank. And you'll recall from the diagram we had at the start of the presentation, we talked about the different levels of acknowledgements. There's up to 4 levels of acknowledgement. If you're using SwiftNet, if you're using other means like, say, host-to-host as an example, there actually is probably more like 2 different levels of acknowledgement. But whatever protocol you're using to connect to the bank, you're going to see examples of the latest status that is provided, and that information you would ideally want integrated into your payment log, your dashboard, or something. I've shown an example here and blacked a few things out. Not to make it any sort of product demonstration, I just took an old screenshot as an example of a report that some people would typically rely upon. So showing you the basic information that's really important is what is the last acknowledgement that I received and what's the status of that? Is it okay? Is it not? Was it received? Was it rejected? Was there some sort of problem? This sort of view in dashboard mode is going to help you understand yes, there's a problem, or no, there's not a problem. And it also allows you to monitor each stage of the workflow and then reconcile against what you thought you sent. This is a very important point to ensure that the acknowledgments are automatically integrated, not manually integrated, but automatically integrated into whatever payment dashboard, payment view, payment system you might be using, and ensuring that you look at, here's what I sent, and here's what the bank says that they received. Are they the same? I know it sounds very basic, Tom, when I present it like that, but that is, in effect, what we're looking for. We want to know what we sent versus what we received, and was it valid or was it not. We also, for other things like cash management reasons, want to know if the payment got sent or got tripped up partway, but we also want to make sure that what we're sending and what we're expected to send are the same thing.
Yeah, and exactly. You want to, this is nice to have like a dashboard like this, you know, more from exception monitoring, because you spend 80% of your time on 20% of the activity, and making sure those payments get through. Definitely, it's nice to know.
No, agreed completely. So it's a pretty basic idea. I'm not revolutionizing bank connectivity discussions by any means with this slide, but I think the point is pretty simple, is that make sure that you review your acknowledgments. Don't just take them for granted that they happened. Now, on that reconciliation theme, it's not just the acts that we want to look at. We actually want to, and I think is the best practice, and then Tom, I know we've talked about this before, we want to reconcile the intraday payments, those outgoing payments, with expected payment transactions. So what I mean by that is that obviously, if you generate payments within your TMS or ERP, you're generating cash flows for those outgoing payments. So that's something that, you know, I send a payment and maybe an item goes in my cash position, so I see, oh, outgoing payments are such and such. Then I get my intraday reporting from the bank, and that's going to generate actual transactions. These are the transactions, whether you're in summary or detailed form, are the ones that I actually sent out, and you're able to just very easily identify the variances. Again, it's not rocket science, obviously, Tom, but in fairness, it is a practice that not everyone necessarily does. A lot of people do prior day rec, but for intraday, not everyone is necessarily doing this. And the difference in timing between knowing today what actually was the variance, if there were any, between what I sent and what actually got sent versus waiting till tomorrow morning can be pretty important when we're talking about fraud and cybercrime.
Yeah, definitely. I looked back to some of our benchmark data to figure out how many accounts a typical company reconciles, and it's 25 bank accounts per FTE in their organization, and it takes them typically 2 hours to do that. But if there's an exception, it typically takes 2 days to respond and follow up on that. So if we're talking about a fraud environment that's moving much more faster and faster, you know, having that intraday reconcilement is, you know, when I did it, it was more of a scan to make sure I understood everything and understood the information in there. But you know, to have something more concrete is definitely very helpful in light of mitigating fraud and helping, you know, speed up that reconcilement process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the tools are there. The information is there. So it's definitely an opportunity for Treasury folks to be able to look at this, and it's a good idea. The sooner you get on things, the quicker that you can deal with some sort of problem if there was one. Now, on that idea around if there was a problem, one of the areas, and I don't see this utilized very often, this kind of, we'll say, workflow change monitoring system, or whatever terminology you want to use. I like to use the word control center, but it is important, and you can see the bullet points here. Number one, it's important to monitor those changes to payment workflows. So if there are changes within your Treasury or ERP system, or even your bank portal, around who can approve things, or different limits, or adding new users, even looking at just the number of files that have been uploaded or sent to the bank, it's really important to understand what's going on and have some sort of dashboard view that says, here's what's going on. So-and-so decided to change their approval, or a certain type of payment now only needs one level of approval instead of two, or the limit for maybe has increased from 2 million to 5 million. These are the sorts of things that maybe they're perfectly fine, but it's important to have your thumb on the pulse of what's going on, especially if you're not just a very centralized organization with one or two users and you can literally throw a bouncy ball and hit them in the head in terms of all your different folks that that could potentially touch a payment in the organization. As organizations grow, you're going to find that you can't literally see them eye to eye because people are in different places in the organization, different places in the world. And as a result, making sure that these workflows are monitored becomes even more important. Often integrated with that kind of dashboard, and you see this in the second point, is the just ability to have some sort of high-level green, yellow, red. That's the example in the screenshot, but it doesn't really matter how you do it. It's just so that, to your point, Tom, making sure, what you mentioned in the previous slide, making sure that you can see that sniff test, that overall, what variances do I have to look at rather than scanning through pages and pages and pages of information. You want those variances, if there is one or if there's something you need to look at or some sort of exception, you want that to pop so that you can understand, oh, there's something that I need to pay attention to that's out of the ordinary. And obviously, your definition of the out of the ordinary may differ from someone else's, which is why you want a little bit of flexibility in designing and having the information flow into these dashboards. So I know it's kind of a long monologue on that point, Tom, but I know it's one that's important to you as well.
Yeah, and I think having this for an exception process monitoring, in light of what I mentioned before about having scalable processes, in light of acquisitions in a changing business climate, it's more important than ever.
Yeah, fully agreed. So that was going through the 7 different points, all the way from actually getting access to the system through sending payments to obviously acknowledging and reconciling those different payments so that what you thought you sent was actually what you sent, and you can monitor all those different pieces of the workflow. It would be unfair of us to talk about such things but not talk about what potentially is happening going forward in the bank connectivity space. So one of those things, Tom, and I know this is one that you and I have talked quite a bit about, is this idea of instant or more instant payments in some cases. So I'll kind of let you comment on just some of the things that you're seeing, both for instant payments like we're starting to see in Europe, as well as like same-day ACHs and even SWIFT's GPII, their Global Payment Innovation Initiative, which is obviously looking to make cross-border payments same day, those sorts of things, and what you're seeing in the space.
Yeah, I think as we see more and more of these coming to light, and we're participants on the Fed Faster Payments Task Force, we have an eye into the SWIFT's GPII. We certainly know people at the clearinghouse. There's a few things that are developing that move together. It seems like there's more of these payment types offering up some type of a directory, and through the Fed Business Payments Coalition, we've worked on the B2B directory, which is going to be offered. It's starting to get a life of its own, but that in theory is kind of what some of these are offering. Likewise, the SWIFT GPII has a tracker, a directory, and an observer tool. Again, better transparency for the payment, instantaneous, ubiquitous, some of these things. I think we're still a few years away from seeing this being more instant, but definitely if it's working on the existing rails of trying to get information faster, and even looking at it holistically and even looking at it from rewriting something is what we're working with the Fed on as well. So definitely more change to come in this, but the themes developing from it are transparency, instantaneousness, and certainly that directory type of structure.
Yeah, agreed. And most of these, especially like SWIFT GPII as an example, really a great initiative to increase transparency and almost give us what I like to kind of call that tracking number approach that this time of year I think we're all familiar with when we do online shopping and trying to figure out where that package went. This kind of bringing this kind of concept to the payment space I think is excellent. Obviously, the reason that some of these additional transparency is needed is for the simple reasons at the bottom of the slide. Is if you have more quicker payments, great vocabulary. If you have quicker payments moving more quickly, then you really need to stop those unauthorized payments before they start, and that's increasingly important. It kind of puts more focus on corporates to ensure that the front part of their workflow is secure and more secure than it is, so that they have no concerns about how do I call that payment back, because they're not having those unauthorized payments being sent in the first place. I know that's obviously the objective. No one wants to have unauthorized payments created, but you just need to ensure that that front part of your workflow is even more secure as payments get a little bit faster and clear a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you want faster payments, but you don't want faster fraud. That's what the goal is.
On that, and as I mentioned a moment ago, this initiative by SWIFT is a great one that takes place this coming year and rolls out over a period of time after that. But it's that transparency. It really allows that better audit of where the payment went. I love that feature. I'm really looking forward to that, as are many of our customers, for the simple reason that it makes things a little bit more convenient and gives you a better idea of what's going on from a payment standpoint, never mind offering you more tools to combat potentially unauthorized payments going out the door. So I think that's definitely a great one. Now, one that's maybe not coming into effect in 2017, if we can be so bold to say such things, Tom, is this idea of distributed ledger technology, or blockchain, which is kind of more commonly called. There's still some time for this kind of technology to be adopted for mainstream. Certainly we continue to see, maybe not the same volume and same frequency, but we continue to see at least daily, and not every couple of days, some new press release about a new organization that's using blockchain for this or that. The reason why it's not going to be adopted mainstream for a little while is because there's a lot of steps to utilize this type of technology in an external environment where you're doing peer-to-peer payments, business-to-business payments, that sort of thing. There's a lot of things that the existing rails in terms of correspondent banking, some of the networks like SWIFT that play a great role in bridging those banks together and providing the ability to send payments one to another. There's a lot of things in there that corporates need, such as non-repudiation, such as effectively knowing that if you send a payment out that and it doesn't work out, that you know who the bank is going to stand behind that. They're going to fix it. They're going to deal with it. So that's the sort of thing that needs to be worked out for things like blockchain, distributed ledger technology to really work. But obviously the technology itself offers some interesting opportunities, and this is one that potentially offers maybe more security than some of the options out there, at least in theory, but there's a lot of things that have to happen between now and then in order for that to be real. I know, Tom, it's sort of an emerging area, and the membership I know is looking for more information on it rather than providing a lot of feedback on the use of blockchain so far, but it has some relevance in the discussion, I think.
It does, and I think if you look at a lot of your bank products that our members use, for, foreign exchange, debt, capital markets, there's a lot of applicability potentially for blockchain, and I think as we progress, I think it's even more paramount for Treasury professionals to be on the forefront of it in their companies. So if there's discussions about accepting, it was Bitcoin, but now it's the back-end ledger of Bitcoin is blockchain. So if there's more discussion about using a ledger system, you definitely want to rope Treasury in to talk about the payment channel and the payment methodology and the remittance information. And I actually see Treasury taking a more commanding role over this in light of the banking touch points that it has and overall applicability it has across a lot of the Treasury products that it could be utilized on.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of use cases for this, and I'm not arguing the potential of it in any way, but as you said, corporate treasurers, CFOs, Treasury teams, they know what the requirements are, and it needs to meet those check marks in order to be adopted for mainstream, in order to be an alternative for payments. And there's a lot of distance between now and then, a lot of runway to be covered before we get to that point, but it's still relevant and part of the conversation. So as we roll into the top of the hour, I know we could talk about blockchain forever, Tom, but in lieu of doing such things, we'll kind of conclude and offer people an opportunity to ask some questions. So number one, connectivity channel. Swift is a great connectivity channel, as I mentioned many times. It's not the only one, but it certainly is one. When we're talking about security, connectivity channel is not the problem. I've heard people suggest things like that, and it's just not the case. It's securing access to and from that channel which presents the most risk, and that's the responsibility of the people using it. Sometimes the vendor can provide certain things, yes, to make it more secure, but in the end, you have to, as a corporate, you have to be able to think of what kind of security do I want, how do I want to protect things. But you're going to find that the connectivity channel is the absolute least of your concerns compared to all the other points that we talked about. It's not that it's not important. You definitely want to make sure that it's well covered, it meets your needs, etc. But the fact is that that's not where the problems lie. When we see exposures, when we see poor practices, poor controls, we're typically seen in other parts of the workflow, and it's really understanding where those exposure points, such as payment initiation, such as lack of reconciliation, such as making sure your systems can't be accessed just by user ID and password. It's those sorts of things that tend to need a bit more attention. But obviously every company is going to be a little bit different, so not just painting it with the broad brush necessarily, but just identifying where we typically see most of the potential opportunities for improvement. Cloud connectivity offers some advantages. Tom gave a great example earlier on where, in past days you kind of had to segregate and put a ring around the dial-up machine to the bank. Obviously we don't use dial-up anymore, but the fact is that when you have installed connectivity, that presents some challenges from a fraud and cybercrime standpoint, because now you're protecting against whatever risks might be within your own internal environment within an organization. And IT will be the first to tell you that going to cloud reduces some of those risks. It offers some potential areas that need to be addressed, of course, when you go to the cloud, but presuming that those are addressed, then you reduce risk by going to the cloud, is what any CIO and CTO will tell you. So if connectivity is offered within a single system rather than a patchwork of solutions, that definitely provides some more security and more comfort and more alignment with what information security policies you have within your organization. So that's a bit of a mouthful there, but I think it summarizes our presentation fairly well in the sense that you can protect connectivity. You can do a really good job protecting connectivity. There's lots of great providers, lots of great tools, lots of great connectivity channels out there. And it's just important to understand each piece within your connectivity overall workflow and solution to make sure that you're protecting it in the best way. So with that, definitely want to give you the opportunity to ask a few questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, but definitely want to do that. So feel free to ask. If we don't get to it, then we'll certainly be able to answer offline as well.
And Bob, maybe I'll just add one more comment to the concluding remarks. I think you mentioned about working in the cloud, and one of the takeaways we had from our advisory group meeting was get a hold of your cloud policy. If your IT group publishes one, understand what their goals and what their aspirations and aims are, and if you need a technology solution, it needs to fit within those parameters, certainly as a minimum. But understanding what is the policy, who's in charge of it, and certainly to the extent you can read and understand it, from treasury professionals aren't necessarily IT technology savvy, but I think partnering with them is often a challenge in getting resources, certainly. So some of that is off on their own, and that's one of the challenges in treasury is always doing more with less, and this is not an area that you can really do that because you've got more at risk in terms of payments and things, and certainly. So I'll just conclude on that.
Yeah, no, that sounds fine, and I agree with that. You definitely don't want to skimp and kind of cut corners necessarily, because the potential consequences can be quite dangerous, and we don't want dangers when we're talking about connectivity and the potential for sending unauthorized payments. So for questions, as we mentioned at the start, use the chat window and ask away. And as we run out of time, maybe there's not really a great opportunity to ask some of those questions, but I'll turn it over to my colleague Elena, who introduced the session, to see if there are any questions that we should address, maybe one or two of the most. And okay, fair enough. I'm sort of hearing offline that there are some questions, but we do have to use the hard stop at the top of the hour. So we will answer all those questions offline. And thank you for all of them. I kind of see some of them coming through, and there's some good ones. But we'll answer those for you afterwards. So at this point, we'll end the session, but I want to say thank you very much to Tom. Definitely read this AFP, Treasury and Practice Guide, that Tom worked so hard in putting together, and I definitely want to make sure that everyone has good value from that. It's a great piece, and I really like it as well. So with that, Tom, thank you very much for your participation today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for letting me participate, and thank you for sponsoring our latest Treasury and Practice Guide. And I think users will find it very helpful and get a few nuggets to take away with.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and we will see you in the next webinar, which for Kariba is actually tomorrow. So some of you may join again tomorrow, and what a great week of webinars. Thank you very much.
Thanks.